The Haunting of Fort Vallory. The sun hung low in the autumn sky as Jonathan Collins stood before the imposing stone gates of Fort Vallory. The air was thick with the scent of decaying leaves, and the wind whispered through the tall, twisted oaks that bordered the path. Fort Vallory, nestled deep in the wilderness of the Appalachian Mountains, had been abandoned for over a century. Once a symbol of military strength during the colonial wars, it was now a crumbling relic of the past. Its walls, once proud and tall, were now covered in moss and vines, the stone foundations cracked and uneven. Jonathan, a historian with a passion for lost places, had always been drawn to the fort's mysterious history. But this was more than just a historical investigation. It was personal. Jonathan's great-great-grandfather, Captain Elias Collins, had been stationed at Fort Vallory in its final years. The story that had been passed down through the Collins family was that Captain Collins had led a doomed expedition into the surrounding forests and never returned. His disappearance was never explained, and many speculated that it had something to do with the fort's dark reputation. A reputation steeped in whispers of hauntings, strange occurrences, and unexplainable deaths. Jonathan had spent years researching the fort's history, piecing together its past from faded records, letters, and journals. Every account he found pointed to the same conclusion. Something sinister lurked within the walls of Fort Vallory. Locals believed it to be cursed, and those who ventured too close reported seeing shadowy figures and hearing ghostly voices in the dead of night. Despite the warnings, Jonathan had always been skeptical. He believed there was a logical explanation behind every ghost story. But as he stood before the fort's gates, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cool autumn air. With a deep breath, Jonathan pushed open the rusted iron gate, the creak echoing through the stillness. The courtyard inside was overgrown, the grass reaching up to his knees. Weeds and small trees sprouted from the cracks in the stone, and the remnants of long-forgotten barracks loomed in the distance. Jonathan walked cautiously, his footsteps crunching on the gravel as he moved deeper into the fort. The air felt heavy, as if the fort itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. He made his way to the old command building, the place where Captain Collins had been stationed. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, and when Jonathan pushed it open, the wood groaned as if in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of mildew. The room was dark, the only light coming from the cracks in the roof where beams of late afternoon sunlight pierced through. As Jonathan scanned the room, his eyes fell on an old desk, still standing in the corner, covered in a thick layer of dust. On the wall behind the desk hung a tattered map, its edges curled with age. Jonathan walked over to the desk, brushing away the dust with his hand. He could imagine his great-great-grandfather sitting here, poring over maps and letters, unaware of the fate that awaited him. On the desk, there was an old journal. Its leather cover was cracked and faded, but the pages inside were still intact. Jonathan carefully opened it, and his breath caught in his throat when he saw the name on the first page. Captain Elias Collins. His hands trembled as he flipped through the pages, reading the entries. At first, they were mundane, reports of patrols, supply orders, and the occasional skirmish with local tribes. But as Jonathan read further, the tone of the journal changed. The entries became more erratic, filled with references to strange occurrences within the fort. Elias wrote of hearing whispers in the night, of seeing figures moving through the shadows that disappeared when approached. His men had grown uneasy, claiming they were being watched, and several soldiers had disappeared without a trace. One entry, dated just days before his great-great-grandfather's disappearance, sent a shiver down Jonathan's spine. October 13th, 1823. Something is wrong within these walls. The men are restless, and I cannot explain the feeling that has taken hold of this place. There is something here, something ancient and evil. I hear it at night, calling to me, whispering my name. I fear I will not return from the forest, but I must go. I must uncover the truth of what haunts Fort Vallory. Jonathan closed the journal, his heart pounding in his chest. Could it be that his great-great-grandfather had been right? Had something truly malevolent taken hold of the fort? He stood in the empty room, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. Suddenly, a cold gust of wind swept through the building, extinguishing the weak light that filtered through the roof. The room was plunged into darkness, and in that moment, Jonathan felt it. A presence. The temperature dropped sharply, and the air around him seemed to hum with energy. He turned, his eyes straining to see in the darkness, but there was nothing. And yet, he wasn't alone. He could feel something watching him, something just beyond the edge of his vision. Then, he heard it, a soft, distant whisper. "Jonathan?" His blood ran cold. The voice was barely audible, but it was unmistakable. It was his name. He spun around, searching for the source, but there was nothing there. The voice came again, this time closer. "Jonathan, help me." It was a man's voice, weak and filled with desperation. Jonathan's heart raced as he stumbled back toward the door, his pulse thudding in his ears. He had to leave, had to get out of this place. But just as he reached the doorway, the temperature plummeted even further, and the whisper turned into a low, guttural moan. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the air grew thick, suffocating. Jonathan bolted out of the building, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He sprinted through the overgrown courtyard, his footsteps pounding against the ground as the fort's dark energy seemed to pursue him. But as he reached the gates, he skidded to a halt. There, standing in front of him, was a figure. A man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a tattered military uniform. Jonathan's breath caught in his throat as the figure stepped forward, revealing a gaunt, pale face beneath the brim of a weathered hat. The man's eyes were hollow, and his skin was stretched tight over his bones. He raised a trembling hand and pointed at Jonathan. "Help me?" The figure rasped. Jonathan's legs felt like lead, his body frozen in place. He knew, without a doubt, that he was staring at the ghost of Captain Elias Collins. The realization hit him like a wave, and for a moment he couldn't move, couldn't think. But then, as the figure's expression twisted into one of pain and desperation, Jonathan felt a surge of determination. What happened to you?" Jonathan managed to choke out. The figure's voice was barely a whisper, as if the effort to speak was too great. "The forest, the darkness, it took us all. We were not meant to return." Jonathan's mind raced, trying to make sense of the words. His great-great-grandfather had led an expedition into the forest, and something had taken them, something dark and powerful. The ghost stepped closer, and Jonathan could see the raw fear etched into his ancestor's face. "The fort is cursed," Captain Collins whispered. "It will take you too if you do not leave." Jonathan nodded, his throat tight. He backed away, inch by inch, until he felt the cold iron of the gate behind him. Without another word, he turned and ran, not stopping until he reached the safety of the road. He stood there, panting, his mind reeling from what he had just witnessed. Fort Vallory still stood behind him, a silent, malevolent presence in the fading light. But Jonathan knew he would never return. The fort's dark history was no longer a mystery to him. It was a prison, a place where souls were trapped, bound by an ancient evil that had taken root long before the first stone was laid. As Jonathan walked away from the fort, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, following him. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the faint echo of a voice. "Jonathan, help me." He quickened his pace, the weight of his family's history pressing down on him like a curse.